All right. Day 10 of becoming more well read. Um, this is gonna be the last push. We are still in chapter 17. No, chapter something. But this gonna be the nah. We in chapter we're in chapter 17. This is our last push. We're gonna get through it today. Icarus, what goes up must come down. Um, but yeah, if you've just been trying to read more, um, just tap in, pull up a chair. Feel free to throw me on while you wash some dishes or something like that. Um, Gonna hop right into it. Um, it is the last push of chapter 17. Page 199. Plotting a coup. Let's get to it. Jobs was not good at taking no for an answer. He went to Scully's office in early May 1985 and asked for more time to show that he could manage the Macintosh division. He would prove himself as an operations guy. He promised. Scully didn't back down. Jobs next tried a direct challenge. He asked Scully to resign. I think you really lost your stride, Jobs told him. You really were great. You were really great the first year and everything went wonderful. But something happened. Scully, who generally was even tempered, lashed back, pointing out that Jobs had been unable to get the Macintosh software developed, come up with new models, or win customers. The meeting degenerated into a shouting match about who was the worst manager. After Jobs stalked out, Scully turned away from the glass wall of his office, where others had been looking in on the meeting, and wept. Yeah, Steve is still crazy. Um, Try to trick him out of the spot. Like, yeah, man, just go ahead and resign. I think you did better your first year. I'll come in. I'll just take my role. Forget what I was talking about as far as like just taking a little operations guy role. You could just resign and well, everything be good. Scully's like, nah, bro. Like, you haven't gotten customers. You haven't created new models. You haven't like no. But he wept after that. Matters began to come to a head on Tuesday, May 14th, when the Macintosh team made its quarterly review presentation to Scully and other corporate leaders. Jobs still had not relinquished control of the division, and he was defiant when he arrived in the corporate boardroom with his team. He and Scully began by clashing over what the division's mission was. Jobs said it was to sell more Macintosh machines. Scully said it was to serve the interests of the Apple. Jobs said it was to sell more Macintosh machines. Scully said it was to serve the interests of the Apple company as a whole. What's up, Pepper? What's up? My fault. Pepper wanted to say what's up. What's up? All right. Scully said it was to serve the interests of the Apple company as a whole. As usual, there was little cooperation among the divisions. For one thing, the Macintosh team was planning new disk drives that were different from those being developed by the Apple II division. The debate, according to the minutes, took a full hour. Jobs then described the projects underway: a more powerful Mac, which would take the place of the discounted Lisa, and software called File Server, which would allow Macintosh users to share files on a network. Scully learned for the first time that these projects were going to be late. He gave a cold critique of Murray's marketing record, Belleville's missed engineering deadlines, and Jobs' overall management. Despite all of this, Jobs ended the meeting with a plea to Scully in front of all the others there, to be given one more chance to prove he could run a division. Scully refused. That night, Jobs took his Macintosh team out to dinner at Nina's Cafe in Woodside. Jean Louis Gassi was in town because Scully wanted him to prepare to take over the Macintosh division, and Jobs invited him to join them. Belleville proposed a toast to those of us who really understand what the world a world according to Steve Jobs is all about. That phrase, the world according to Steve, had been used dismissively by others at Apple, who belittled the reality warp he created. After the others left, Belleville sat with Jobs in his Mercedes and urged him to organize a battle to the death with Scully. Hmm. Months earlier, Apple had gotten the right to export computers to China, and Jobs had been invited to sign a deal in the Great Hall of the People over the 1985 Memorial Day weekend. He had told Scully, who decided he wanted to go himself, which was just fine with Jobs. Jobs decided to use Scully's absence to execute his coup. Throughout the week leading up to Memorial Day, he took a lot of people on walks to share his plans. I'm going to launch a coup while John is in China, he told Mike Murray. 7 days in May. Thursday, May 23rd. At his regular Thursday meeting with his top lieutenants in the McIntosh division, Jobs told his inner circle about his plan to oust Scully. He also confided in the corporate human resources director Jay Elliott, who told him bluntly that the proposed rebellion wouldn't work. Elliott had talked to some board members and urged them to stand up for Jobs, but he discovered that most of the board was with Scully, as were most members of Apple's senior staff. Yet Jobs barreled ahead. That's what I was about to say. Like, how you gonna just plan a coup? Because like in his mind, it's like, yeah, I just do a coup, and it's good. Like you have to have people on your side, and it seems like the board was already on Scully's side when they outed you and wanted you to take a lesser role. Yeah, that's just all right. But he discovered that most of the board was with Scully, as were the most members of Apple's senior staff. Yet Jobs barreled ahead. He even revealed his plans to Gassi on a walk around the parking lot. Despite the fact that Gassi had come from Paris to take his job, I made the mistake of telling Gassi, Jobs wirely concealed years later. That evening, Apple's general counsel, Al Eisenstadt, had a small barbecue at his house for Scully, Gassi, and their wives. When Gassi told Eisenstadt what Jobs was plotting, he recommended that Gassi inform Scully. Steve was trying to raise a cabal and have a coup to get rid of John, Gassi recalled. In the den of Al Eisenstadt's house, I put my index finger lightly on John's breastbone and said, If you leave tomorrow for China, you could be ousted. Steve's plotting to get rid of you. Friday, May 24th. Scully canceled his trip and decided to confront Jobs at the executive staff meeting on Friday morning. Jobs arrived late, and he saw that his usual seat next to Scully, who sat at the head of the table, was taken. He sat instead at the far end. He was dressed in a well-tailored suit and looked energized. Scully looked pale. He announced that he was dispensing with the agenda to confront the issue on everyone's mind. It comes to my attention that you'd like to throw me out of the company, he said, looking directly at Jobs. I'd like to ask you if that's true. Jobs was not expecting this, but he was never shy about indulging in brutal honesty. His eyes narrowed, and he fixed Scully with his unblinking stare. I think you're bad for Apple, and I think you're the wrong person to run the company, he replied, coldly and slowly. You really should leave this company. You don't know how to operate and never have. He accused Scully of not understanding the product development process, and then he added a self-centered swipe. I wanted you here to help me grow, and you've been ineffective in helping me. As the rest of the room sat frozen, Scully finally lost his temper. That's good though. I like the way he frames like just his arguments. Like you were brought in to help me and to help me control things, and it's like you haven't been able to control me to control things. So it's like why would you be better? Uh, Scully finally lost his temper. A childhood stutter that had not afflicted him for 20 years started to return. I don't trust you, and I won't tolerate a lack of trust, he stammered. When Jobs claimed that he would be better than Scully at running the company, Scully took a gamble. He decided to poll the room on that question. He pulled off this clever maneuver, Jobs recalled, still smarting 25 years later. It was at the executive committee meeting, and he said, It's me or Steve. Who do you vote for? He set the whole thing up so that you kind of have to be an idiot to vote for me. So how did you think a coup was going to work? Suddenly, the frozen onlookers began to squirm. Dale Yoakum had to go first. He said he loved Jobs and wanted him to continue to play some role in the company, but he worked up the nerve to conclude with Jobs staring at him, that he respected Scully and would support him to run the company. Eisenstadt faced Jobs directly and said much the same thing. He liked Jobs but was supporting Scully. Regis McKenna, who sat in on senior staff meetings as an outside consultant, was more direct. He looked at Jobs and told him he was not ready to run the company, something he had told him before. Others sided with Scully as well. For Bill Campbell, it was particularly tough. He was fond of Jobs and didn't particularly like Scully. His voice quavered a bit as he told Jobs he had decided to support Scully, and he'd urged the two to the two of them to work it out, and find some role for Jobs to play in the company. You can't let Steve leave this company, he told Scully. Jobs looked shattered. I guess I know where things stand, he said, and bolted out of the door. No one followed. He went back to his office, gathered his longtime loyalists on the Macintosh staff, and started to cry. He would have to leave Apple, as he said. As he started to walk out the door, Debbie Coleman restrained him. She and others urged him to settle down and not do anything hasty. He should take the weekend to regroup. Perhaps there was a way to prevent the company from being torn apart. Scully was devastated by his victory. Like a wounded warrior, he retreated to Eisenstadt's office and asked the corporate counsel to go for a ride. When they got into Eisenstadt's Porsche, Scully lamented, I don't know whether I can go through with this. When Eisenstadt asked what he meant, Scully responded, I think I'm going to resign. You can't, Eisenstadt protested. Apple will fall apart. I'm going to resign, Scully declared. I don't think I'm right for the company. I think you're copping out, Eisenstadt replied. You got to stand up to him. Then he drove Scully home. Scully's wife was surprised to see him back in the middle of the day. I failed, he said to her forlornly. She was a volatile woman who had never liked Jobs or appreciated her husband's infatuation with him. So when she heard what had happened, she jumped into her car and sped over to Jobs' office. Informed that he had gone to the Good Earth restaurant, she marched over there and confronted him in the parking lot. As he was coming out with the loyalists on his Macintosh team, Steve, can I talk to you? She said. His jaw dropped. Do you have any idea what a privilege it has been to even know someone as fine as John Scully? She demanded. He averted his gaze. Can't you look me in the eyes when I'm talking to you? She asked. But when Jobs did so, giving her his practiced unblinking stare, she recoiled. Never mind. Don't look at me, she said. When I look into most people's eyes, I see a soul. When I look into your eyes, I see a bottomless pit, an empty hole, a dead zone. Then she walked away. Man. Saturday, May 25th. Mike Murray drove to Jobs' house in Woodside to offer some advice. He should consider accepting the role of being a new product visionary, starting Apple Labs and getting away from headquarters. Jobs seemed willing to consider it, but first he would have to restore peace with Scully. So he picked up the telephone and surprised Scully with an olive branch. Could they meet the following afternoon? Jobs asked, and take a walk together in the hills above Stanford University. They had walked there in the past in happier times, and maybe on such a walk they could work things out. Jobs did not know that Scully had told Eisenstadt he wanted to quit, but by then it didn't matter. Overnight he had changed his mind and decided to stay. Despite the blow up the day before, he was still eager for Jobs to like him, so he agreed to meet the next afternoon. If Jobs was prepping for conciliation, it didn't show in the choice of a movie he wanted to see with Mary that night. He picked Patton, the epic of the of this never surrender general. He had lent his copy of the tape to his father, who had once ferried troops for the general, so he drove to his childhood home with Murray to retrieve it. His parents weren't there and he didn't have a key. They walked around back, checked for unlocked doors and windows, and finally gave up. The video store didn't have a copy of Patton in stock, so in the end, he had to settle for watching the 1983 film adaptation of Harold Pinter's Betrayal. Sunday, May 26th. As planned, Jobs and Scully met in the back of the Stanford campus on Sunday afternoon and walked for several hours amid the rolling hills and horse pastures. Jobs reiterated his plea that he should have an operational role at Apple. This time, Scully stood firm. It won't work, he kept saying. Scully urged him to take the role of being a product visionary with a lab of his own. But Jobs rejected this as making him into a mere figurehead, defying all connection to reality. He countered with the proposal that Scully give up control of the entire company to him. He's crazy, bruh. I'm coming to you, Olive Branch. Let's take a walk in the hills. Let's. I'll just be a operational guy. Steve, that's not gonna work. Let's just put you off in your own thing, Apple Labs, and you could just be a product visionary. It's like you give him an inch and he try to take a mile. Yeah, man, resign. Give up your control. I'll do it. I bet you would. He countered with the proposal that Scully give up control of the entire company to him. Why don't you become chairman and I'll become president and chief executive officer? He suggested. Scully was struck by how earnest he seemed. Steve, that doesn't make any sense, Scully replied. Giles then proposed that they split the duties of running the company, with him handling the product side and Scully handling marketing and business. But the board had not only emboldened Scully, it had ordered him to bring Jobs to heel. One person has got to run the company, he replied. I've got the support and you don't. On his way home, Jobs stopped at Mike Mercula's house. He wasn't there, so Jobs left a message asking him to come to dinner the following evening. He would also invite the core of loyalists from his Macintosh team. He hoped that they could persuade of the folly of the folly Mercula of the folly of siding with Scully. Monday, May 27th, Memorial Day was sunny and warm. The Macintosh team loyalists Debbie Coleman, Mike Murray, Susan Barnes, and Bob Belleville got to Jobs' Woodside home an hour before the scheduled dinner so that they could plot strategy. Sitting on the patio as the sun set, Coleman told Jobs that he should accept Scully's offer to be a product visionary and help start up Apple Labs. Of all the inner circle, Coleman was the most willing to be realistic. In the new organization plan, Scully had tapped her to run the manufacturing division because he knew that her loyalty was to Apple and not just to Jobs. Some of the others were more hawkish. They wanted to urge Mercula to support a reorganization plan that puts Jobs in charge. When Mercula showed up, he agreed to listen with one proviso. Jobs had to keep quiet. I seriously wanted to hear the thoughts of the Macintosh team, not watch Jobs enlist them in a rebellion. He recalled. As it turned coolly, they went inside the sparsely furnished mansion and sat by a fireplace. Instead of letting it turn into a gripe session, Mercula made them focus on very specific management issues, such as what had caused the problem in producing the file server software and why the Macintosh distribution system had not responded well to the change in demand. When they were finished, Mercula bluntly declined to back Jobs. I said I wouldn't support his plan, and that, and that was the end of that. Mercula recalled. Scully was the boss. They were mad and emotional and putting together a revolt, but that's not how you do things. It's Tuesday, May 28th. His ire stoked. What does that mean? Ire. His ire. His ire stoked by hearing from Mercula that Jobs had spent the previous evening trying to divert him. Scully walked over to Jobs' office on Tuesday morning. He had talked to the board, he said, and he had its support. He wanted Jobs out. Then he drove to Mercula's house, where he gave a presentation of his reorganization plans. Man, they tried to keep him. They wanted to keep him, let him rock out. We kept just trying to tear it down. Scully, you gotta go, man. Bye bye. Sayonara. His ire. His ire stoked him to go ahead and say sayonara. Um, then he drove to Mercula's house where he gave a presentation on his reorganization plans. Mercula asked detailed questions, and at the end, he gave Scully his blessing. When he got back to his office, Scully called the other members of the board just to make sure he still had their backing. He did. At that point, he called Jobs to make sure he understood. The board had given final approval of his reorganization plan, which would proceed that week. Gassi would take over control of Jobs' beloved Macintosh, as well as other products, and there was no other division for Jobs to run. Scully was still somewhat conciliatory. He told Jobs that he could stay on with the title of board chairman and be a product visionary with no operational duties. But by this point, even the idea of starting a skunk works such as Apple Labs was no longer on the table. It finally sank in. Jobs realized there was no appeal, no way to warp the reality. He broke down in tears and started making phone calls to Bill Campbell, Jay Elliott, Mike Murray, and others. Murray's wife, Joyce, was on an overseas call when Jobs phoned, and the operator broke in saying it was an emergency. It better be important, she told the operator. It is, she heard Jobs say. When her husband got on the phone, Jobs was crying. It's over, he said. Then he hung up. Murray was worried that Jobs was so despondent he might do something rash, so he called back. There was no answer, so he drove to Woodside. No one came to the door when he knocked, so he went around back and climbed up some exterior steps and looked in the bedroom. Jobs was lying there on a mattress in his unfurnished room. He let Murray in and they talked until almost dawn. Wednesday, May 29th. Jobs finally got hold of a tape of Patton, which he watched Wednesday evening, but Murray prevented him from getting stoked up for another battle. Instead, he urged Jobs to come in on Friday for Scully's announcement of the reorganization plan. There was no option left other than to play the good soldier rather than the renegade commander. They gotta play your role sometimes, man. Like a Rolling Stone. Jobs slipped quietly into the back row of the auditorium to listen to Scully explain to the troops the new order of battle. There were a lot of sideways glances, but a few people acknowledged him, and none came over to provide public displays of affection. He stared without blinking at Scully, who would remember Steve's look of contempt years later. It's unyielding, Scully recalled, like an X-ray boring inside your bones, down to where you're soft and destructively mortal. For a moment, standing on stage while pretending not to notice Jobs, Scully thought back to a friendly trip they had taken a year earlier to Cambridge, Massachusetts, to visit Jobs' heroes Edwin Land. He had been dethroned from the company he created, Polaroid, and Jobs had said to Scully in disgust all he did was blow a lousy few million, and they took his company away from him. Now Scully reflected he was taking Jobs' company away from him. Blew a few million, and they just took away his company. As Scully went over the organizational chart, he introduced Garcia as the new head of a combined Macintosh and Apple II product group. On the chart was a small box labeled chairman with no lines connecting to it, not to Scully or to anyone else. Scully briefly noted that in that role, Jobs would play the part of a global visionary, but he didn't acknowledge Jobs' presence. There was a smattering of awkward applause. Jobs stayed home for the next few days, blinds drawn, his answering machine on, seeing only his girlfriend, Tina Retzi. For hours on end, he sat there playing his Bob Dylan tapes, especially the times they are changing. He had recited the second verse the day he unveiled the Macintosh to the Apple shareholders 16 months earlier. That verse ended nicely. For the loser now will be later to win. A rescue squad from his former Macintosh posse arrived to dispel the gloom on Sunday night, led by Andy Hertzfeld and Bill Atkinson. Jobs took a while to answer their knock, and then he led them to a room next to the kitchen that was one of the few places with any furniture. With Retzie's help, he served some vegetarian food he had ordered. So what really happened? Hertzfeld asked. Is it really as it? Is it really as bad as it looks? No, it's worse. Jobs grimaced. It's much worse than you can imagine. He blamed Scully for betraying him and said that Apple would not be able to manage without him. His role as chairman, he complained, was completely ceremonial. He was being ejected from his Banley 3 office to a small and almost empty building he nicknamed Siberia. Hertzfeld turned the topic to happier days, and they began to reminisce about the past. Earlier that week, Dylan had released a new album, Empire Burlesque, and Hertzfeld brought a copy that they played on Jobs' high-tech turntable. The most notable track, "When the Night Comes Falling from the Sky," with his apocalyptic message, seemed appropriate for the evening, but Jobs didn't like it. It sounded almost disco, and he gloomily argued that Dylan had been going downhill since Blood on the tracks. Him and cool, Bob Dylan, him, they both going down. So Hertzfeld moved the needle to the last song on the album, Dark Eyes, which was a simple acoustic number featuring Dylan alone on a guitar and a harmonica. It was slow and mournful, and Hertzfeld hoped would remind Jobs of the earlier Dylan tracks he so loved. But Jobs didn't like that song either and had no desire to hear the rest of the album. Jobs' overwrought reaction was understandable. Scully had once been a father figure to him. So had Mike Mercoulis. So had Arthur Rock. That week, all three had abandoned him. It gets to it gets back to the deep feeling of being rejected at an early age. His friend and lawyer George Riley later said, "It's a deep part of his own mythology, and it defines himself. It defines to himself who he is." Jobs recalled years later, "If I felt like I'd been punched, the air knocked out of me, I couldn't breathe. Losing the support of Arthur Rock was especially painful. Arthur had been like a father to me," Jobs said. "He took me under his wing. Rock had taught him about opera, and he and his wife Tony had been his host in San Francisco and Aspen. I remember driving into San Francisco one time, and I said to him, 'God, that Bank of America building is ugly,' he said. No, it's the best. And he proceeded to lecture me, and he was right, of course. Years later, Jobs' eyes welled with tears as he recounted the story. He chose Scully over me. That really threw me for a loop. I never thought he would abandon me. Making matters worse was that his beloved company was now in the hands of a man he considered a bozo. The board felt that I couldn't run a company, and that was their decision to make. He said, but they made one mistake. They should have separated the decision of what to do with me and what to do with Scully. They should have fired Scully, even if they didn't think I was ready to run Apple. Even as his personal gloom slowly lifted, his anger at Scully, his feeling of betrayal deepened. The situation worsened when Scully told a group of analysts that he considered Jobs irrelevant to the company, despite his title as chairman. From an operations standpoint, there is no role either today or in the future for Steve Jobs, he said. I don't know what he'll do. The blunt comments shocked the group, and a gasp went through the auditorium. Perhaps getting away to Europe would help, Jobs thought. So in June, he went to Paris, where he spoke at an Apple event and went to a dinner honoring Vice President George H.W. Bush. From there, he went to Italy, where he drove the hills of Tuscany with the Red Sea and bought a bike so he could spend time riding by himself. In Florence, he soaked in the architecture of the city and texture of the building materials. Particularly memorable, particularly memorable were the paving stones, which came from the Il Casson quarry near the Tuscan town of Firenzuola. They were a calming bluish gray. 20 years later, he would decide that the floors of most major Apple stores would be made of the sandstone. The Apple II was just going on sale in Russia, so Jobs headed off to Moscow, where he met up with Al Eisenstadt. Because there was a problem getting Washington's approval for some of the required export license, they visited a commercial attaché at the American embassy in Moscow, Mike Marin. He warned them that there were strict laws against sharing technology with the Soviets. Jobs was annoyed. At the Paris trade show, Vice President Bush had encouraged him to get computers into Russia in order to foment revolution from below. Over dinner at a Georgian restaurant that specialized in shish kebab, Jobs continued his rant. How could you suggest American law when it so obviously benefits our this violates American law when it so obviously benefits our interests? He asked Marin. By putting Macs in the hands of Russians, they could print out they could print all their newspapers. Jobs also showed his feisty side in Moscow by insisting on talking about Trotsky, the charismatic revolutionary who fell out of favor and was ordered assassinated by Stalin. At one point, the KGB agent assigned to him suggested he tone down his fervor. You don't want to talk about Trotsky, he said. Our historians have been studying the situation, and we don't believe he's a great man anymore. That didn't help. When they got to the state university in Moscow to speak to computer students, Jobs began his speech by praising Trotsky. He was a revolutionary Jobs could identify with. Jobs and Eisenstadt attended the July 4th party at the American embassy, and in his thank you letter to the ambassador Arthur Hartman, Eisenstadt noted that Jobs planned to pursue Apple's ventures in Russia more vigorously in the coming year. We are tentatively planning on returning to Moscow in September. For a moment, it looked as if Scully hoped that Jobs would turn into a global visionary for the company might come. As if Scully's hope that Jobs. For a moment, it looked as if Scully's hope that Jobs would turn into a global visionary for the company might come to pass, but it was not to be. Something much different was in store for September. September. Chapter 17 knocked out. Check. Took me forever to get through that. On to chapter 17 next are page 210. Still got like 400 pages to go. We'll just keep going day at a time. Becoming more well read. Day 10. Hope to be back for day 11. God willing, you know. But yeah, man. Icarus, what goes up must come down, and it appears Jobs has come down. He is a global visionary. Try to do coups and take people away and all that stuff, but what's he gonna do next? We'll figure it out. Stay tuned. We'll be back for day 11 of Becoming More Over It. If you, like I said, if you just trying to read more, feel free to pull up a chair and tap in with me.